The batwing saloon doors you see swinging open in every Western you have ever watched almost certainly did not exist in the actual building you were about to walk into. Most frontier saloons used standard wooden doors on iron hinges, or in the hottest months, no door at all, and the pair of decorative hip-high panels that left your head and boots exposed to a Kansas winter would have gotten the owner laughed out of Dodge City in under a week. That single image, the one Hollywood burned into your memory, is the cleanest example of how thoroughly the real Wild West saloon has been replaced by a comfortable lie. Welcome to Coyote territory. If this is your first visit, subscribe and drop a comment below telling us what you believed about these places before today. Now let us walk inside the real thing. Before there is a church, there is a saloon. Before there is a school, a bank, a courthouse, or a jail, there is a saloon. This is not a generalization about the frontier spirit. It is the documented sequence of events in town after town across the American West between 1860 and 1900. When a mining strike hit Colorado in 1859 and prospectors flooded into what would become Denver, the first permanent structure raised on the site was a log saloon. The first building in Tombstone, Arizona, was a saloon. The first building in Deadwood, South Dakota, was a saloon. Abilene, Dodge City, Cheyenne, Virginia City. The pattern holds across every boomtown on the frontier, and the reason is straightforward. The man who got there first with a tent and a barrel of whiskey was the richest man in town before a single nail was driven into a proper building. You need to understand what kind of money that represents. A shot of frontier whiskey sold for somewhere between 10 and 25 cents, depending on the town and the year. That sounds modest until you consider that a common laborer in 1870 earned roughly $1 a day, which means a single shot cost between a tenth and a quarter of a man's daily wages. A cattle hand finishing a 3-month drive from Texas to Abilene arrived with roughly $90 in accumulated pay, and typically spent most of it within a week. The saloon owner watched that money flow across a plank bar and understood something the cowhand did not. The alcohol was almost incidental. It was just the door charge. The whiskey itself deserves examination, because what you would have been handed across that bar in the 1870s was not whiskey in any sense you would recognize today. Aged bourbon and proper rye were expensive to ship and slow to produce, and frontier saloons were not in the business of patience. What most establishments served was a concoction that went by names the bartenders gave it with no apparent shame. You could order Coffin Varnish, which contained raw grain alcohol, chewing tobacco water, and a measure of burnt sugar for color. You could order Tarantula juice, a blend that commonly included cayenne pepper, the heat intended to produce a burning sensation the customer might mistake for quality. You could order 40 rod, a name referencing the folk belief that it could drop a man at 40 rods, roughly 220 yards, which was obviously not true, but captured the general experience of drinking it accurately enough. The cheapest operations served a product called red eye, colored with iron rust or red chili powder to mimic the appearance of aged whiskey, and fortified with grain alcohol of no confirmed origin. None of this was a secret. The customers knew. They drank it anyway, because the alternative on the frontier in 1872 was not a better saloon. The alternative was no social contact at all. You need to sit with that for a moment. A cowhand, a miner, or a railroad laborer in this period typically lived in a bunkhouse or a tent with 10 to 20 other men, worked 6 days a week in conditions that would not satisfy a single modern safety inspection, and had access to no entertainment, no family, and no means of communication with anyone outside his immediate work camp. The saloon was not a temptation he was failing to resist. It was the only room in the entire landscape that was warm, lit, and full of human noise. This is why the social function of the frontier saloon was so different from anything Hollywood has ever put on screen. Walk into that room and you could buy a newspaper because most saloons kept reading material available for customers. You could play cards, scan the notice board for employment, get a meal if the establishment ran a kitchen, and hear news from the last town on the stage route. In communities where no other public building existed yet, the saloon served as a courtroom. Circuit judges who traveled regular routes through frontier territories held proceedings inside saloons because there was nowhere else with enough floor space to seat a proceeding. Town meetings were held in saloons. Political debates were held in saloons. And here is the detail that surprises almost everyone who hears it. Church services were held in saloons. This was not a scandal. It was a practical arrangement that both parties accepted without apparent difficulty. Methodist and Baptist circuit riders who traveled the same frontier routes as judges and merchants needed a roof and a congregation, and the saloon provided both. The preacher would arrive on a Sunday morning. The bartender would move the bottles to one end of the bar, set out whatever chairs were available, and a congregation would gather in the same room where men had been losing money at cards the night before. Some saloon owners reportedly refused to charge the minister for use of the space. A few charged him anyway. Neither detail is surprising once you understand that the saloon was, functionally, the town hall. Now, step up to the bar and look at what you are actually standing in. The floor beneath your boots in the average frontier saloon is not hardwood. It is packed dirt. Wooden floors existed in prosperous establishments in larger towns, but the majority of frontier saloons were built fast and cheap, and a dirt floor, swept with a broom every few days, was the standard. The ceiling, if there is one, is low and unventilated. A dozen oil lamps burn through the evening, producing heat and smoke that have nowhere to go, and by 10 o'clock on a busy night, the air in the room is thick enough to taste. The smell is what you notice first, and it is not romantic. It is stale alcohol, tobacco smoke, sawdust, and the accumulated evidence of men who have covered long distances without access to bathing facilities. The spittoon is not a novelty prop. There is one positioned at every 10 feet of bar, and its presence is a necessity, because virtually every man in the room is chewing tobacco, and the alternative to a designated receptacle is the floor, which is also considered acceptable under the standards of the era. A single shot glass serves multiple customers at the busier establishments, unless you specifically request your own. The bar itself is frequently a plank laid across two barrels, rather than the carved mahogany counter of film and television, because mahogany must be shipped from somewhere, and a plank does the same job. The back bar mirror, which you have seen in 100 westerns, does exist in better-funded saloons, and for a specific reason. Glass was expensive to transport across the frontier, and a large mirror behind the bar was a signal to customers that this establishment had capital, and therefore presumably stocked a better class of product. It was an advertisement built into the architecture. The mirror also had a secondary function that no saloon owner would have mentioned openly. It allowed the bartender to watch the room behind him without turning around. The gambling tables are where you need to pay attention, because this is where the real economics of the frontier saloon operate. Alcohol margins were thin. A bartender who watered the whiskey or shorted the pour was difficult to catch in a town with no reliable legal system and easy to replace. But the gambling tables were a different matter entirely. The house percentage on a properly run game is a mathematical constant, and the man who owns the table owns something that pays regardless of who sits down. Faro was the dominant gambling game in the American West from roughly 1850 through 1910, and it has been almost completely erased from popular memory, despite being played in virtually every saloon on the frontier. You have almost certainly never seen it portrayed accurately in a film or a television production, which is remarkable given that any honest depiction of a frontier saloon would place a faro layout at the center of the room, not a poker game. Poker existed and was played, but faro was the game men lined up for, and there is a clear reason. Faro offered the best odds of any house game available in the average saloon. The house advantage on a properly dealt faro game was less than 1.5% when players tracked the cards correctly, making it genuinely close to an even contest. This made it enormously popular with players and sufficiently profitable for house operators who ran enough volume to make the margin matter. A faro operation required a dealer, a casekeeper who tracked the cards dealt using a small abacus-like counting device, and a lookout who watched the table for cheating from both sides of the layout. Players bet against a painted board showing the 13 card values, wagering on which value would appear next from the dealing box.
The game was fast, the mechanics were transparent enough to follow, and it was the game frontier gamblers trusted more than any other because crooked dealing was harder to conceal with a casekeeper watching the count. Rigged dealing mechanisms existed and were used, but a careful player watching the box and the count could identify most of them. The entire ecosystem around faro, the specialized dealers, the casekeepers, the lookouts, the hand-painted layouts and spring-loaded dealing boxes represented a skilled labor market that vanished so completely after Prohibition that most Americans today have never heard the game's name spoken aloud. Wyatt Earp understood faro. He understood it well enough to build his primary income around it in Tombstone, Arizona, which is where his story intersects with the real economics of the frontier saloon in a way that almost no popular account gets right. Earp arrived in Tombstone in December of 1879. He was not primarily a lawman when he arrived. He was a gambling operator looking for a stake in a prosperous game in a prosperous town. By July of 1880, he had secured a faro dealing concession at the Oriental Saloon on Allen Street, one of the most profitable gambling establishments in Tombstone at the time. His arrangement with the Oriental's ownership gave him a percentage of the faro profits in exchange for his presence at the table, his reputation as a straight dealer, and the general deterrent effect his name had on men who might otherwise have caused trouble at the layout. The Oriental Saloon, at its peak, was generating significant nightly revenue, and Earp's percentage of the faro operation produced income that contemporary accounts place as high as $1,000 on a strong night. To put that figure in context against 1880 wages, the average Tombstone miner earned $3 a day, meaning that a single good night at the faro table equaled what a working miner would bring home in roughly a year of labor. Earp's simultaneous role as a deputy marshal was less a calling than a calculated investment in the stability of the environment where his real income was made. A tombstone where men settled disputes freely was bad for business. A tombstone where a badge enforced some minimum standard of order was a tombstone where men kept walking through the door of the Oriental to sit down at his table. This reframes nearly everything you have ever been told about Wyatt Earp, and it does not diminish him. It makes him a recognizable businessman operating in a legal vacuum where the only law that reliably functioned was the law of profit. He was very good at that law. The women who worked in frontier saloons occupy a category that popular history has consistently collapsed into a single moral judgment that serves neither accuracy nor the women themselves. Dance hall women, who were the most visible female presence in the typical frontier saloon, were employees with wages and defined job functions. Their primary role was to encourage men to purchase drinks and to participate in paid dances, typically priced at 10 cents per dance, with the woman receiving a percentage commission on each ticket and sometimes an additional percentage on drinks purchased during her conversations with customers. The saloons that employed them were running a structured revenue operation, and the dance hall woman was a calculated piece of that structure, not an afterthought. The conditions of that employment were frequently difficult, the pay inconsistent, and the social position of a dance hall woman in frontier society was low enough that moving beyond it was genuinely hard.
but collapsing the entire population into a silent, moral footnote in the standard frontier narrative does something dishonest to the historical record. These were women who had made a specific economic calculation in a landscape where their options were domestic service, marriage, or work in an industry the rest of society preferred to avoid looking at directly. Many arrived in frontier towns from eastern cities, where industrial work had paid them even less and offered no more security. Some accumulated enough to leave, some did not. The historical record contains both outcomes in roughly equal proportion, and neither fits the simplified version that a century of popular entertainment has preferred to tell. The Anti-Saloon League was founded in Oberlin, Ohio in 1893, and its founding is the clearest evidence that the frontier saloon had become something the rest of American society could no longer absorb quietly. The League was not a collection of well-meaning churchgoers expressing personal disapproval. It was a sophisticated political organization with a national fundraising operation, a publishing division that produced a dedicated newspaper called The American Issue, and a strategy of targeting local and state elections with single-issue precision. Within 17 years of its founding, the League had achieved prohibition in 9 states. Within 27 years, it had pushed the 18th Amendment through Congress and into ratification. Understanding why the League succeeded requires understanding what the urban saloon had become by 1890, because by that point, the frontier saloon and the city saloon had diverged into distinct institutions. The frontier saloon of Dodge City and Tombstone was, in its chaotic way, primarily a social institution serving isolated working men with nowhere else to be. The saloon of Chicago's South Side, or New York's Lower East Side in the 1880s, had evolved into something with more systemic reach. Urban saloons functioned as political machines, delivering block votes to aldermen and ward bosses in exchange for licensing protection and selective non-interference from the police. They extended credit to working-class customers in amounts that created dependency. They operated 18 hours a day in neighborhoods where the primary alternative social space was a tenement apartment shared with 8 people. The League's founders were not wrong that the urban saloon had become a problem, embedded in the political and economic structure of American cities. They were wrong about what abolishing it would produce, and the consequences of that error played out across the following decade in ways that a person paying attention might have anticipated. You can mark the practical end of the frontier saloon era somewhere around 1910, a full decade before national prohibition arrived to formalize it. By that point, the boomtown conditions that had created the original institution had largely resolved. Railroads connected most frontier settlements to reliable supply lines. Legal systems had established themselves with enough permanence to matter. Churches, schools, and courthouses occupied the physical and civic ground that saloons had claimed first. The men who had needed the saloon as their only social institution now had other options, and the saloon evolved accordingly, becoming something closer to the neighborhood bar of the eastern cities. The specific institution of the frontier saloon, the dirt floor, the coffin varnish, the pharaoh layout with the casekeeper counting down the box, the circuit judge holding proceedings between the whiskey barrels, the dance hall woman working her percentage. That particular thing was already a historical artifact before prohibition arrived to make it formally illegal. What survived is the mythology. Hollywood needed a visual shorthand for the West, and the saloon provided it. The swinging doors, the upright piano, the high-stakes poker game at the back table, the bar fight that leaves everyone's knuckles clean. These images were in circulation almost as quickly as the real saloons that inspired them, because dime novelists and traveling journalists understood what their audience wanted, and what the audience wanted was not the smell of a dirt floor at 2 in the morning. They wanted the romance of the thing. and the romance is what lasted. Drop a comment below and tell us which piece of this surprised you most, because almost everyone who watches this comes in with at least one assumption that does not survive contact with the actual history. The swinging doors were almost never there. The rest of what you believed about the place probably was not either.